Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. How are you doing today, Kieran?
Hello, always a tremendous pleasure to join you. I prefer to be in the studio with you all, but alas, today I couldn't. So, by the dubious magic of technology, I'm joining you from afar.
Berlin, I believe you're coming to us from today, and I'm glad that you've been able to at least be in the studio in cybernetic form. Coming up this evening, the government's homelessness minister has been revealed as a rogue landlord. Police charge 3 Defend Our Juries activists under terror law. We ask, where did Britain go wrong? And we take a look at what divides Britain's right from Britain's far right. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Rushanar Ali is the MP for Bethnal Green and Stepney and the current Minister for Homelessness. Although by the looks of things, she might have taken that title a little too literally. Reports from the iPaper's Vicky Spratt last night alleged that the landlord MP kicked her tenants out of their 4-bedroom townhouse in East London, only to then relist the property on the rental market with a whopping £700 hike in the rent. The iPaper reports that she gave her tenants 4 months to vacate the property, with a source close to Ali claiming that this was in order to put the property up for sale. Yet the property had been relisted for rent in a matter of weeks after the tenants had vacated at the new higher price. This was confirmed by the iPaper when a reporter visited the property this week, and the new tenants confirmed that the new rental price and that they had been living in the property for 4 or 5 months. So, why might Ali have done this? Well, in Labour's Renters' Rights Bill, due to come into force next year, this kind of behaviour would be unlawful. Landlords such as Ali would have to wait at least 6 months to be able to relist a property at a higher rent, having ended a previous tenancy for the purpose of selling under the legislation. The Renters' Rights Bill has been championed by the government, having picked up the baton from failed attempts to reform the private rental sector by the Tories previously. Ali herself has been left with egg on her face, as she had previously criticised, quote, private renters being exploited, and that the Labour government would, quote, empower people to challenge unreasonable rent increases. Here she is last year talking about how unaffordable private rents are in London right now.
The average monthly private rent in London increased by 9.7% in the last year and is over 1.5 times higher than the average monthly rent in England.
This apparent hypocrisy has provoked plenty of calls to resign from across the political spectrum. This is from the London Renters' Union. Rushanar Ali must resign. Rising rents are a leading cause of homelessness. How can we trust the government to tackle the rent crisis when the homelessness minister is profiteering from insecure housing? Landlords should have no place in Parliament. And this is from Tory chairman Kevin Hollinrake. This is a staggering hypocrisy from Rushanar Ali. It is totally unacceptable for the government's minister in charge of Labour's new renters' laws and homelessness to have turfed out her own tenants in order to hike the rent by over 20%. I'm sorry, but she must resign. One of the most bizarre calls from her resignation came from Talk TV presenter and fellow landlord Christo Fufas.
It makes her position completely untenable because she has spoken before about private renters being exploited. And I am a landlord. What if I want to sell my property and I don't manage to sell it? Well, I'm not going to be able to do what she's doing because the legislation that is coming in is going to stop me being able to do that. And this renters legislation, and this is where you and I are going to disagree, it's actually creating a situation where landlords are putting up their rents now in order to cover any shortfall.
But let's see what happens in the long term about protecting renters. The point is, I don't think this story is going away anytime soon.
He has to resign from this position.
Well, it's funny for him to say, well, she's having to be doing these things because of her own legislation, and other landlords are going to be doing the same. They're increasing rent. It's bad for renters because they're trying to be able to catch it before this legislation comes into place. Well, which one is it, Christo? Which one is it, right? Because if she's just doing what other landlords are doing, why is it hypocritical? If you think, as you do so clearly, that people just react normally in terms of how policy is being put into place and in the kind of self-serving interest there, or other landlords are doing it. Well, if other landlords are doing it, why is it bad that she does it? Because clearly, on here on the left, we understand that there is this difference between the social utility of using housing as a good, as a public good, for its use value, rather than for its exchange value to be able to extract rent, which he does as a landlord. So from his position, it doesn't make any sense for him to think that she should be resigning here, other than because she is being hypocritical. Well, the reality is that what she's done there has no moral basis, which he hasn't critiqued at all. His critique here is just, well, she says one thing and does the other, which, whilst I understand is frustrating and that people get angry when ministers are hypocritical, the reality is that you just shouldn't be kicking people out of your house and then raising the rent on the new tenants when they come in. Ideally, we should have far better rights for renters, which include much longer term tenancies, so that landlords can't just up and sell whenever they want to and leave people in the lurch. But clearly he doesn't agree. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper was asked to comment on this story by Sky News this morning.
You may have seen one of your colleagues, the Homelessness Minister, has made the news, Rushanara Ali, ending the contract of her private tenants, then relisting her property for £700 more a month. What do you make of that? Is that a good look?
So I don't know any of the details of this, but I understand that she has followed all of the rules in this case.
They tried this with Giftgate, right? They tried this when everyone was getting angry about the fact that there was a clear conflict of interest with ministers and Labour members of Parliament, or when they were in opposition as well, people receiving things like free hospitality or free tickets or free clothes from people who you could perceive have a conflict of interest with their role as a member of Parliament, right? And the only defence that you ever got from them in that regard was, we've not broken any rules. And I'm like, well, no one's claiming that you have broken any rules. No one's claiming that Rushanara Ali has broken any rules. In fact, what we think is that the rules are bad and they need changing. And that's the problem here, is that we need to ensure that people are acting in an ethical manner, and that's what the law is there to try and do. Again, we don't think it goes very far. I don't think it goes far enough in terms of what they're changing with the Renters' Rights Bill. But if your only defence of what you're doing is, well, it's technically not illegal, it's not illegal to do these things, right? Well, it's not illegal for me to insult someone's grandmother, but I don't do it because it's not correct. It's not morally correct to do so. So that's not a really good defence here, and it shows you how weak in terms of the ability they have to defend this situation. This is not the first time that the Labour Party has been caught with the landlords of dubious morality on its benches. MP for Ilford South Jazz Athwal was reported last year by the BBC to have rented out flats with, quote, black mould and ant infestations. One resident reported being threatened with eviction if they complained. Athwal is the largest landlord in the Commons with an astonishing 15 rental properties. This is in addition to another Labour MP, Bayo Alaba, who, having previously talked about, quote, the imperative of stable housing for stronger communities, had previously evicted a homeless single mother of two from temporary accommodation that he was renting to the council, a council he was serving on at the time. This is from The Londoner. The tenant was first told she was being evicted in November last year because her landlord wanted to sell the property. She had no idea the landlord in question was a Labour MP. Despite the longer notice period, the tenant was not able to find other accommodation as she awaited her inevitable eviction because the council will not be able to find her alternative homeless accommodation until after it had gone through. The Londoner also reported that she was told by the council she could be potentially moved to Birmingham, that's from London to Birmingham, but have not been able to find any information on her since, and have not been updated on her whereabouts by either Alaba himself or Redbridge Council. Alaba is the fifth largest landlord in Parliament with 7 rental properties, and, for good measure, the third largest Labour MP as a landlord is Gurinder Singh Josan with 8 rental properties. That is according to Landlord Today. So much for the highest quality candidates. We were told throughout the election campaign that Labour was the party of working people. Yet why are so many Labour MPs landlords? Somewhere you don't do any work, you just extract rent, right? There are a staggering 44 Labour MPs who are landlords, including Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves, which is 11% of the Labour benches. This is compared to less than 5% of the adult population being landlords, a more than 2-to-1 overrepresentation within the Labour ranks. This is yet another example of the Labour Party being drastically divorced from its base and turned into a party for rentiers, professionals, lobbyists and career politicians. It's unsurprising that the party's long-time loyal voters are deserting it. And Rushanara Ali should be very worried. Bethnal Green has been a Labour stronghold for the entire post-war period. Only once has it not been a Labour-held constituency, in 2005 when George Galloway for the Respect Party gained the seat in revolt over the war in Iraq. In the 2024 general election, however, history almost repeated itself, with independent candidate Ajmal Mazroor falling just short of unseating Ali by a mere 3.6%. There was a split between other left-wing independents and the Green Party, which allowed Rushanara Ali to just sneak it in. This was most likely due to the backlash over Labour Party's response to the genocide in Gaza and the fact that Ali herself abstained on the SNP ceasefire motion in November of 2023. Things also don't look rosy for her future at the next election either. Friend of the show, Stats for Lefties, has this projection for the seat in question based upon polling averages, including the new left-wing party founded by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, showing that Ali is more than likely to lose her seat to the new party at the next election. Kieran, this has been a whole mess. The Labour Party chock-a-block with landlords, and the landlords that you do have seem to be less than reputable individuals. What's your take?
The reason that this is so maddening is that the housing crisis in the UK, I think, is the single most severe and serious social disaster facing our country. Of course, there are plenty of others. And of course, you could talk about climate change and what that will do to our society, and fair enough. But in the present, I think it's quite clear to me, at least, that the housing crisis and the failure to house people in the UK, and when they are housed, the failure to make sure that the standards about housing are adequate, is the biggest social disaster facing us, because it's a flywheel, if you like, for so many other inequalities: health inequalities, educational inequalities, increase in household and even national debt, low reproductive rates. All of this has causal lines that are linked very, very heavily to the failure to house people in the UK. And so, we look, however naively, we look to the only kind of vector or bully pulpit left capable of taking on these huge interests, the landed interests, landlords, landowners, and so on, i.e. the House of Commons, only to find that it's chock-a-block with landlords and with the landowning classes. And so it's completely unsurprising in that context that absolutely nothing changes on this. I mean, obviously the renters, the renters bill is some progress, but it does actually ultimately nothing to address the very serious structural problems around housing in the UK, which have been accumulating very rapidly since 1979. I mean, you just have to watch any of the kind of BBC archive shorts to see that housing wasn't perfect in the UK before 1979, but that was more a question of the quality of the stock rather than the sufficiency of it. In other words, enough housing for the number of people in the country. Landlords should be nowhere near the House of Commons. They should be nowhere near the House of Commons. Rushnara Ali is a very bad person. I mean, I used to work in Tower Hamlets, and by the way, Helena, I can absolutely confirm that I would say the instrumental and decisive factor in her almost losing her seat in Tower Hamlets absolutely was Gaza. I mean, the mood in that constituency was very, very clear. Rushnara Ali stands for nothing. I don't have any trouble believing that. She coasts. She takes what she can while she's coasting. She's cut from that kind of cloth as a politician, unfortunately. However, she is a symptom. She is a symptom of a wider problem. And that problem is that we allow landowners and landlords to fill our legislative chamber. And that is we're giving permission to a very direct and clear, as far as I'm concerned, conflict of interest. My MP, as things stand, may also be my landlord. That seems to me to be manifestly absurd. And of course, when you have a system like that, you will attract jackals and vultures like Jazz Athwell and Rushnara Ali, who are attracted to politics as part of a wider project to line their pockets.
What's so crazy about this? Obviously, there were loads of calls to resign over this, and full well she won't resign. They won't remove the whip. Nothing will be done about this, right? Being a landlord who tries to jack up rents, and again, we don't know why there was any truth to the idea that what she specifically did this. She might have tried to sell it and then not been able to sell it and then put it back up on the market. We don't know. But regardless, right, insofar as we've seen here that the rent still went up £700 between it getting unlisted on the rental market and then relisted. That's a more than 20% increase, right? So it's clear that she's trying to make as much money out of this as possible. Yet we see people who vote against things such as depraved cuts to welfare for the disabled, for wanting to remove the 2-child benefit cap, losing the whip over those things. And yet we see plenty of landlords on these benches, landlords that have engaged in questionable behaviour. And none of these people have lost the whip. And in fact, they are championed as being the new MPs on the block. In some case, of course, Rushnara Ali's been there for quite a while now, but Jaz Athwal was one of the 2024 intake. So was Bayo Alaba. And it just drives me around the bend. The standard to which the people on the left of the party are held to and the people on the right of the party are held to within Labour, because it's totally different. And quite frankly, given the relationship that landlords have broadly with working class people in this country, there should be zero Labour Party MPs that are landlords. I mean, there should be no MPs that are landlords regardless. People, especially people who are getting paid £93,000 a year. You don't need extra rental income. I'm just sorry, you just don't, especially when it's the vast majority of cases, people who are poorer than you essentially paying for your mortgage for you. That's as far as I'm concerned. A high-ranking European Commission official has become the first Brussels authority to call Israel's relentless assault on Gaza a genocide. In comments to Politico on Thursday, European Commission Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera said that Israel's actions in Gaza look, quote, very much like genocide, as she described Palestinians as being targeted, killed, and condemned to starve by the rogue state. Here's what Ribera said. What we are seeing is a concrete population being targeted, killed, and condemned to starve to death. A concrete population is confined with no homes, being destroyed, no food, water, or medicines, being forbidden to access, and subject to bombing and shooting even when they are trying to get humanitarian aid. Any humanity is absent, and no witnesses are allowed. If it is not genocide, it looks very much like the definition used to express its meaning. What has been said and done by the Israeli authorities go far beyond the international law limits. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears set to challenge those limits even further as he pushes his government to approve his full plan for a full military occupation of Gaza. Appearing on Fox News, he was asked about that plan.
Will Israel take control of all of Gaza?
We intend to, in order to assure our security, remove Hamas there, enable the population to be free of Gaza, and to pass it to civilian governance. That is not Hamas and not anyone advocating the destruction of Israel. That's what we want to do. We want to liberate ourselves and liberate the people of Gaza from the awful terror of Hamas.
So liberation through occupation. Not exactly a strategy with an unbridled history of success. And that's assuming you give Netanyahu the benefit of the doubt there. Not necessarily advisable, given how often he's brazenly lied to the world about his intentions in Gaza. Netanyahu's security cabinet is currently meeting to decide whether to approve that strategy, with the military reportedly representing two plans, one for a full invasion and one for a siege on the remaining Hamas strongholds. The military is supporting the second plan, not out of care for Palestinians, no, but for fear that further Israeli troops, as well as hostages, will be killed in the ensuing carnage. In the meantime, Palestinians continue to be killed at an unprecedented rate. Médecins Sans Frontières has today called for the immediate closure of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's food distribution program in the Strip. That's the CIA-linked organization that employs mercenaries to distribute limited amounts of food to Palestinians while the Israeli military shoots at them. Over 1,400 Palestinians have been killed seeking aid since the end of May, around 900 of them at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution points. In a post on social media, Médecins Sans Frontières said this: in MSF's nearly 54 years of operations, rarely have we seen such levels of systematic violence against unarmed civilians. The GHF-run food distributions in Gaza, Palestine have become sites of orchestrated killing and dehumanization, not humanitarian aid. As this graph from The Guardian shows, the MSF is absolutely right about the systemic violence. The number of Palestinians killed or injured at Israeli-controlled aid distribution sites has been steadily growing since the end of May. Médecins Sans Frontières also released this report. Called "This is not aid, this is orchestrated killing," the report includes eyewitness testimony, medical analysis, and accounts from hospital staff. One Médecins Sans Frontières worker in Gaza said this: I see the roads get busy. I hear the hollering and the heckling. I see people on carts with bags of food. Then the injured begin arriving, almost at the same time. I have patients with gunshot wounds who are literally carried in on the same plastic bags they used to collect food. The report also says this: in just 7 weeks after the GHF sites opened, MSF teams treated 71 children with gunshot injuries, 25 aged 0 to 14 and 46 aged 15 to 17. Individualised patient data confirmed that 41 of these children were shot at or near GHF distribution sites. The remaining 30 arrived at MSF health centres as part of mass casualty influxes that coincided with the opening or closing of GHF sites and presented with fresh wounds, strongly suggesting a link to the distributions. For context, that is 10 children being shot every week at these sites. Of course, hundreds of adults have also been killed and many more injured. One of those to perish on Wednesday was 41-year-old former Palestinian national football player Suleiman Al-Obaid, also known as the Palestinian Pele. In a statement, the Palestinian Football Association said this: former national team player and star of the Khadmat al-Shati team, Suleiman Al-Obaid, was martyred after the occupation forces targeted those waiting for humanitarian aid in the southern Gaza Strip on Wednesday. The number of athletes and their families killed in Gaza now stands at nearly 700. Kieran, it's all very, very depressing to cover and to look at, but the tide is beginning to turn in terms of institutions now who were beginning to recognize the genocide. Of course, B'Tselem in Israel came out very recently condemning their own government for calling it a genocide. What do you make of all this?
I like to think that I'm not judgmental and I'm not critical and I'm not pompous about this stuff. Okay. It's very easy to say, we've been suffering all this time. Where have you been? And I think with members of civil society, that's policy language. Let's just say ordinary people who don't work in politics or maybe the media. I'm very open-minded about them seeing the images that we're all seeing coming through our screens and saying, do you know what? I've been in a sleep. I've been in a slumber. This is objectionable and I object. Welcome, not a moment too soon, but doesn't matter. Great to have you on board, genuinely. But when it comes to politicians, political organizations who have no shortage of epistemic access, have no shortage of access to information and knowledge, when it comes to journalists or people who work at media organizations whose very job it is, who get paid to know what's going on, those individuals, having a kind of epiphany at this stage, I have to say I have a bit of trouble stomaching it. And I think the reason is, if they can sit in front of me and say, Kieran, we really, really didn't know. We were laboring under an illusion as well. We were brainwashed. Even though we had access to all this information, you have to be, then fine. I think I would be able to eventually welcome them into the fold and see them as equal to the rest of us who have been toiling for Palestinian rights and self-determination for a very long time. But I suspect, Helena, and part of the reason I struggle so much with people in category B, I suspect that so many of them have known from the beginning that this either is a genocide or has the makings of something that can very quickly slide into genocide. And so their kind of dithering has cost tens of not individually, but it's contributed to a process that has cost tens of thousands of Palestinian lives. And that I will really struggle to forgive. And if I struggle to forgive it, I can only imagine how Gazans feel, or Palestinians who live in the West Bank feel. As I say, I want to be really clear about this. I want to hold strategic space for people in category B because we need to win this. And in order to win this, we need the opinion formers. I get that. I get it strategically. And then I want to make it clear that they're not the same as, my aunt or, whoever who's just suddenly arrived at consciousness on this. Those people, God bless them, they're welcome anytime. I get that there was a very powerful propaganda machine for many, many years that hid the Palestinians from view and made the Israelis look like saints on earth. I get that. It's not their fault. But people whose jobs are to report the news and uncover the reality of things and who work in politics, so many of them must have known that this was genocide from the start. So many of them. And Helena, I briefly want to say something about the athlete, the footballer, and about athletics generally in Palestine. You get to a point with what's going on in Gaza where you think you're desensitized to everything. And so many horrific things have happened that I think people would almost be forgiven at this stage for being, to an extent, desensitized. But when I hear about footballers who played in the 2014 World Cup qualifiers being shot at an aid depot, it makes me think about when I went to the West Bank and how important football is to Palestinians. Not all Palestinians, of course, you'll find Palestinians who don't like football, but you will find in the West Bank, particularly around Bethlehem, murals of footballers, almost as many murals of footballers as the martyrs. Mohamed Salah, Lionel Messi, particularly, Cristiano Ronaldo, Zinedine Zidane. And the fact that these people play such an important role in Palestinian civil society, it mirrors the fact, but obviously is multiplied many times. It mirrors the fact that in our own society, historically, people from left behind communities, you might say, working class communities who feel that they don't have very much control over their lives, they would take refuge in football. And if that's true of them, imagine how true it is of young people in the West Bank or Gaza, or grown-ups who feel that they have lost everything and have no control over their lives. Football is one of the last few powerful expressions of hope and also escapism for these kids and for these grown-ups. And although it could be said this person was just shot randomly because they're killing Palestinians indiscriminately as well as discriminately, Israel has got a history of targeting athletes and footballers. And that is why.
On Saturday, Group Defend Our Juries is organising a protest involving 500 people who may break the law around the proscription of domestic direct action group Palestine Action. That's led to speculation in the media that police may be overwhelmed by the scale of the protest. So far, 221 people have been arrested across Britain for defying the ban, though none had been charged until today. But just 2 days before that large-scale protest, the police charged 3 people under the Terrorism Act on Thursday, while also publicising it widely on social media and in the press. The 3 people charged are 71-year-old Jeremy Shippen from West Sussex, 71-year-old Judith Murray from Surrey, and 53-year-old Fiona McLean from Hackney. That's right, despite having a combined age of nearly 200 years, these 3 are now facing terrorism charges. In a statement, the Metropolitan Police's actual head of counter-terrorism command said this: "Anyone who displays public support for Palestine Action, a prescribed organisation, is committing an offence under the Terrorism Act and can expect to be arrested, and as these charges show, will be investigated to the full extent of the law. These charges relate to 3 people arrested in central London on the 5th of July. We are also planning to send case files to the Crown Prosecution Service for the other 26 people arrested on the same day. I would strongly advise anyone planning to come to London this weekend to show support for Palestine Action to think about the potential criminal consequences of their actions." So, can we just take a minute? This is a guy who's been trained to tackle Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, other extremists, right? And here he is talking about the terrorist threat of a trio who have 2 centuries on them. He must be thinking, how the fuck did I get here? Jailing pensioners and talking like he's just cracked open an ISIS cell. Kieran, big protests coming soon. What's your take on this one?
I mean, first of all, I think it's pertinent to say that I am so deeply, as I know you are, Helena, and I know so many of us are, deeply, deeply offended that given the scenes that we are seeing day after day relentlessly from Gaza, and the suffering, the scale of the suffering and the scale of the abject horror, the horror show that comes through our screens every single day from Gaza, and the complicity, the direct, active complicity of our own government and other governments in Europe and the West, that we are the ones who have to dance carefully in what we say around the law, while at the same time, members of the Israeli government who are either directly wanted by the ICC or there is a criminal investigation underway about their wider government at the ICC, while they parade on private jets, obscene monsters parading on private jets, waltzing through the corridors of power seamlessly, while we're the ones who have to manage and manicure and massage what it is we say about Saturday's protests. I mean, what I would say, I guess, is this. Norman Finkelstein, when he was arrested in New York a few years ago, I think it was during the Great March of Return massacre in 2018, although I may be wrong about that, he said, I realized that I wasn't doing anything commensurate or even vaguely commensurate to the urgency of what was being done, the urgency of the situation and the horror of what was being inflicted on the Palestinians. And so I decided that I would push what I can do to its limits. I would, in his words, I would get arrested. That's what Norman Finkelstein said in 2018. Certainly, if anybody wants to try and begin to climb the mountain of commensurality against what we're seeing, then attending on Saturday, civil disobedience and direct action, whatever form that may take, is, I think, a first down payment on all of that. And, I just want to end on Keir Starmer. Oscar Wilde said that he'd been about himself, that he'd been the spendthrift of his own genius. I thought it was a great phrase, spendthrift of his own genius. Well, Keir Starmer has been the spendthrift of his own credibility and his own humanity. He's been an arsonist of his own humanity and his own credibility. He thinks right now that he's a clever purveyor of statecraft, that he keeps the Americans happy, he keeps the Europeans. No, he has been an arsonist of his own credibility and of his own legacy. And he will learn that in dark, lonely days in retirement.
We can only hope so. I'm just going to have to look at one of your comments here. I've got £10 from Joe Billy Bobbable. Thank you very much for the super chat. King Charles and the royal family are the largest landowners in the world, personally owning 1/6 of the surface area of the planet. It's wild how little this is spoken about. Very, very true, very true, very true. It's weird how we talk about benefit scroungers all the time, yet we never mention the royal family. Very strange. Pollster More in Common have done an excellent job of gauging the nation's opinion on all manner of issues, from Israel-Palestine to what voters' favourite kind of cheese is. Last week they came up with a very interesting poll, asking respondents who answered yes to the question, Britain is on the wrong track, to state what they thought the main reason was that Britain had been put onto the wrong track. By far the most chosen answer was the 2016 Brexit referendum, followed by the coronavirus pandemic and then the election of Tony Blair in 1997. Only a combined 13% of respondents identified either the election of Margaret Thatcher or the 2008 financial crisis, however, and the coalition government did not feature at all in any of these polls, which is crazy to me. It's crazy to me that the coalition government doesn't feature in this particular poll here, because when you look at so much of these, you see so much cause and effect, right? You see so much cause and effect. And of course, there's always going to be recency bias in these polls. There's always going to be recency bias. So, but that notwithstanding, what led to Brexit? What was the reason that Brexit happened? Now, obviously, there were plenty of people who had very specific viewpoints on the European Union that were negatively polarised already. But to be able to have the kind of victory to upend the status quo that led to Brexit, that Brexit was a manifestation of, there needs to be some level of dissatisfaction that creates it. And all of those things that created a dissatisfied population was all of the stuff that you see elsewhere within that poll. You look at the 2008 financial crisis, which was used as the justification for austerity. So austerity was basically the brainchild of George Osborne because of a paper called Growth in a Time of Debt, written by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff coming up to 2010. And because the Labour government had run up a big budget deficit, engaging in counter-cyclical stimulus to kick the economy back into gear post-recession during the financial crisis, they said, well, look, our government debt as a percentage of GDP is over this specific level. It says in this paper, we have to cut spending. Now, of course, they wanted to do that anyway. But regardless, the kind of formula that had been created during the Labour government of previous was that there was a bit more money that was put from council block grants into poorer areas of the country. So that meant the social infrastructure that was necessary to keep people in at least good standing in terms of their standard of living had been kind of erased by the slashing of those council block grants, which were heavily targeted at the poorer areas of the country, right? So that, combined with the loss of jobs from deindustrialization, which was obviously a Blairite thing, because they were carrying on from a bunch of Thatcherite groupthink around how you do the economy. The deindustrialization was kind of born in the Thatcherite era but continued by Blair, also led to the breakdown in levels of prosperity in the regions, in the post-industrial regions around the country. And it's those areas that voted for Brexit. So the financial crisis, which was helped by Thatcher, was what created austerity, which what created Brexit. So it seems incredibly short-sighted, again, recency bias notwithstanding, that we just forget that there is a material reason for all of these things happening. And again, for me personally, whilst I think that the actual single moment that was a real kind of, that really kind of broke apart the country was 2008, you can't really have the kind of effect on this country that 2008 had without the election of Thatcher in 1979. The freeing up of the financial sector, the fact that the financial sector became so much of our economy, that the bubble that was created by Thatcher's Big Bang was what led to us being overexposed to 2008, even though 2008 was an American phenomenon that had effects over here. And then because of that, that led to all of the different dominoes falling for Brexit to happen. And a lot of Remainers, I think, tend to put Brexit up on a pedestal as this single, unique ill. You know the kind of person. If you're watching at home, you know the kind of person who will say, well, actually, 2012 was great because we had the Olympics and everyone came together. I'm like, there were riots. There were riots on the street in 2011. People were burning down London, well, parts of London in 2011 because of the social unrest caused because of the social infrastructure being torn apart by austerity. So there was this material kind of gap in the kind of hardcore Remainers who view Brexit as a unique ill that they didn't understand because they weren't the people who were damaged. Their livelihoods weren't damaged by austerity or the financial crisis and were turbocharged by Thatcherite deregulation. So that's what I think in terms of the point of inflection on where this country started to go wrong. I think most socialists hold Thatcher as a unique ill. Kieran, where would you put this point of inflection?
Boringly, I completely agree with everything you said, Helena. And I think recency bias shouldn't apply here because Brexit is in the poll and so on. And I think that austerity, I mean, you basically covered it all, right? But the failure so first of all, there's cutting of services. Yeah, of course, disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. And even as an economic modality to try and stimulate growth in the short to medium term, it was a palpable failure because Britain had one of the most sluggish recoveries and is still extremely sluggish recovery. Okay, that's not entirely unique across the G20, but had one of the most sluggish recoveries in the G20 after the austerity politics of Osborne-Cameron or Cameron-Osborne. I think alongside that, the other cardinal sin was the failure when interest rates were basically at zero or actually at zero to borrow and to invest in the next generation of infrastructure. I mean, that is such a severe, that has left such a disastrous legacy for this country. And, you know, where we are going forward and the amount of money that we would have to spend now in order to borrow similar amounts of money. Obviously, the debt repayments would be enormous. I don't personally I think that's arguing that is a false economy in the long run. But there is a point that by comparison to how we could have borrowed and spent 10 years ago, it poses more challenges and it's more problematic. So I think it was a massive instance of structural economic vandalism. And it's quite easy to say this is all on one person. And it's also quite easy, once you do a little bit of learning, to be kind of contrarian about it and say, well, no, that's simplifying it. That's reductionist. It's not all on this one person. But actually, and society is obviously social phenomena, very complex, economic phenomena, sometimes very complex. In this case, actually, it's quite simple. George Osborne was massively instrumental individually in those decisions, those absolutely manifestly disastrous economic decisions. Individually, he was hugely instrumental. So I think you're right. I think obviously, Thatcherism laid the kind of groundwork for so much. I mean, you're right to point out financialization and the financial crisis. And you're right to point out the Big Bang, Thatcher's Big Bang, deregulation of the city in 1986. But I also think that, you pointed out it came from America. there's a boomerang thing here going on, Helena, with our first story, which is that actually, as you pointed out or alluded to, the financial crisis was essentially a crisis of financialization in housing. And it started in America with the subprime mortgage crisis and so on. But the financialization of housing, the big bang moment for that really was under Clinton in the late 1990s, which was essentially taking housing, deregulating, what you could do with housing, and turning it into a bunch of very complex financial instruments that could then be traded in various ways on the financial markets, and exposing housing to that kind of chaos and instability really, really did lead us to 2008, 2009. And, obviously a big theme here in this episode, many of the things we're discussing, is the instability in housing. And I think it's absolutely pertinent to mention that. But yeah, Osborne's austerity hugely supercharged Brexit, hugely supercharged many of the social problems we see today. And he deserves all the hate in the world.
I absolutely agree. I mean, my Twitter bio literally is called, I almost have the George Osborne hate account. I cannot put into words the absolute seething rage I have in my heart for George Osborne as a political figure. One of the single most damaging, because I think you could have fixed Thatcherism. I think that you can always renationalize things. Obviously, the oil sell-off was a really kind of big blunder in terms of the macroeconomy in this country. But I think you could theoretically have fixed it, but because they were at least running deficits in this period. But the George Osborne removal of money from the economy, this unique period where interest rates were zero, just being completely incinerated and thrown into the trash and never utilized, is unforgivable, absolutely unforgivable. Can you just bring up the graphic of the different party affiliations with how they look at where Britain went on the wrong track, which this is even more fascinating to me, right? If you look, I think we've both kind of agreed here that the coalition government of Thatcher, so much to blame of this, right? But Thatcher very specifically, insofar as the economy kind of changed in such a large way around her. The Green Party voters, they uniquely see Thatcher as more of a problem than everybody else, right? Everybody similar talks about Brexit on the kind of more liberal or left-wing end of the spectrum here. But the Greens, far more so than Labour voters, given that the Labour heartlands should be the post-industrial areas that were destroyed by Thatcher. But Green Party voters, no, they uniquely find Thatcher. And in fact, you look at the Liberal Democrat voters here on this particular graphic, and you see that they blame Thatcher even less than Tories do, which is hilarious to me, really. It just shows you the kind of people who vote Liberal Democrat, given that Lib Dems are actually some of the richest voters in the country statistically, because there's not this kind of working class Tory types that you get, whereas Lib Dem voters are kind of uniquely in the kind of upper echelons of the income spectrum. And what's also interesting here is just how much Tony Blair really angers people on the right of politics, specifically Reform UK voters you're seeing there, because they kind of have this unique idea of the constitutional change of Blair being a problem, like the Human Rights Act and adhering to a bunch of EU rules, which is why, of course, Brexit is so low. But I would be really interested to talk to the 13% of Reform UK voters who think that the Brexit referendum was a really bad moment in history. I mean, you're in the wrong party, mate. You're in the wrong party there. And just, again, the non-featuring of George Osborne and David Cameron on these figures here. I mean, they could be in none of the above, but the ones who say none of the above are more likely to be from the right, who'd be less likely to blame them. It's really is crazy figures, and the pandemic is, I don't think that really needs explaining here. Again, what do you make of these party breakdowns, Kieran? They're quite revealing over the ways in which I think that people kind of misapprehend where their party is, or their party that they support is, in relationship to how policy has been passed previously.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of time passes and people forget exactly where their party stood on particular things. And I think Cameron Osborne, that phenomenon is very interesting and very strange. I mean, I wonder whether most of the ire or the wrath towards Cameron Osborne gets kind of funneled into Brexit, by the people who really think that was the worst thing that they ever did. I think the Lib Dem, you're right to put up the Lib Dem versus Tory on Thatcher's legacy. It's very interesting. I think that what it speaks to is that the Tories have changed around the economy much more than the Lib Dems have in recent times. And I think that's probably a kind of realignment of the sort of the reform kind of Trump-esque protectionism that's come into vogue in some parts of the right, of the political right now. And obviously the kind of corollary, the flip side of that is you have to kill your idols, you have to kill your darlings. If your idols and your darlings were Reagan and Thatcher. And that's why we see, people like Farage doing this strange kind of, no, I didn't say that, about his steadfast, indomitable support of Thatcherism up until 6 months ago. And now suddenly he's a kind of economic nationalist, whatever that means in the reform guise. And I think that probably explains that. I think a lot of Tories are fundamentally unimaginative, and they look to Trump and they say America first means Britain first in economic terms. If it's translated to our aisles, that's what it means. And so I think some of them have started to kind of distance themselves from Thatcher's legacy for that reason. I can't be certain. I haven't spoken to people in this poll, but I suspect that's what's going on. Whereas the Lib Dems, they have a very, Nick Clegg kind of embodied it pretty well. They have they believe that the political system is quite broken, obviously, because it doesn't benefit them. And they have some ideas about constitutionalism and so on, but fundamentally they like the liberalisation of the economy.
And that's the thing, right, is that the Lib Dems' unique obsession with Brexit and their inability to look at the broader macroeconomy, it really just belies how much that despite them actually outside of the coalition, they've never had a majority government in their entire existence, right? They had a 5-year period, which they try to make you forget about, by the way. Whenever it's talked about in terms of the 14 years of Tories, you'll notice the Lib Dems will always say 9 years. They don't like you to mention the coalition government, do they? Because they've been totally kind of out of power, and yet they just get always what they want. They always get what they want in terms of the economy, and they just disagree on social issues when it comes to the Conservatives or the kind of cosmopolitanism, I guess, of the European Union, which is, I guess, what they cling to. Obviously, I think that there are some good things the EU does. It's a really good, important diplomatic bloc. As a geopolitical bloc, it's important in a more multipolar world where you need to have allies. You need to show geopolitical strength, right? Having that large bloc together is a good thing. But of course, the kind of high-earning professionals who were supportive of remaining in the European Union, who were Liberal Democrat voters, were completely unaffected by the perceived wage arbitrage that you would have gotten from remaining a member of the single market, right? Having to compete with workers from low-earning countries in Eastern Europe, for example. Now, again, I think these economic factors get kind of overstated, for example, but regardless, they were the people who've always had the best out of governments from the kind of Thatcher era to today. They just disagreed with some social policies or the internationalist policies. So the Liberal Democrats really are just pride flag Thatcherites at this point. And you see them now, these kind of voters getting angry at Keir Starmer over not being pro-business enough and putting taxes on private schools. I'm like, yeah, that's why the Lib Dems didn't vote for the tax on private schools, because they cater to a very well-off and very affluent voter base, again, who can't see anything that is materially wrong with the country outside of how we look on the global stage with regards to our relationships with the European Union. Very, very, very telling data there in my mind. Anti-migration protests at asylum hotels have taken place up and down the country over the last few weeks, and this past weekend was no exception, with demonstrations in Epping, Norfolk and the South Coast. A hotel in London's Islington was also targeted, where anti-migrant protesters faced off against anti-racism demonstrators. Novara's Rivka Brown was on the ground, talking to both sides. It's great reporting, and you can watch that feature on the channel right now. But I want to show you one clip that I found especially interesting, involving two anti-migrant protesters with conflicting views, which are characteristic of a real divide between Britain's right and Britain's far right.
Nothing's going to change, is it? No matter how much we protest, nothing's going to change.
Well, we need revolution.
Yeah, well, we're not doing it like this, are we?
It will come.
When?
Well, we're at Southport. That was good. Southport was very good. Southport was very good.
So do you think that was a good action? What happened there?
They should have done more. Frankly, they should have done more. They should have dragged them out. Enoch Powell was right. They are demographically replacing us. They are doing a genocide. What they are doing is genocide.
Yeah, but that changes on
and
racism.
Someday it'll be like Rwanda.
You've got to let people in the country who contribute and also who want to integrate. A lot of people that come over here don't want to integrate. They go in their own communities.
It doesn't matter if they integrate or not. We are full. It doesn't matter if you have 2 billion coming over and integrating.
And they don't integrate.
The bottom line is, we don't
society.
want to be demographically replaced.
But it makes a barren society, doesn't it?
It doesn't matter.
It
doesn't matter if we have 2 million coming over and they're all eating tea and crumpets. They won't be British.
I know.
Just because they pretend to drink tea and eat crumpets doesn't
But
make them
those
British.
days are over, aren't they?
They're not over.
Well, go on, then get them out then.
Well, we're going to.
Who's we?
Well, do you know what happened? Ethnic enclaves are formed. Ethnic enclaves are formed. That's the way it's going to go. People are going to have to go. I'm not going to hang around them.
What are you going to do then?
Well, I'm going to live in a different area.
Do you think that'll solve the problem? Will that solve the problem?
I don't want to get stabbed.
If you want to solve the problem, you've got to stop the boats
You're
at
never going to
source.
solve the problem by letting them in as long as they are integrating. That's never going to solve the problem.
We should have stopped the boats halfway across the channel, tow them back.
Torpedo the boat. Torpedo one boat and
We'll end this intelligent conversation.
Now, I will start off by saying, if you want to stop the boats at source, maybe stop destabilizing countries in the global south, the UK and America. Just one suggestion from me to you. But I think that kind of juxtaposition of those two viewpoints is really, really interesting. Because I actually think that the man in the grey shirt, he kind of represents closer to the median position on this issue. Most people believe that arriving via small boat is something that is being done illegally in search of economic opportunities to take advantage of the taxpayer, whereas some people come here legally and they integrate, and that's a good thing. And these are two completely distinct groups. When in reality, it's perfectly legal to arrive by irregular means for the purpose of claiming asylum. The vast majority of these cases, especially on appeal, are found to be worthy of having their asylum claim accepted and gaining refugee status. So they're not really illegal. And the issue in terms of them not paying tax, because we don't let them work whilst they're staying in detention, and they're being put up in hotels, because we left the Dublin Protocol, we only had a small boats crisis very recently. We only had a irregular migration crisis from the last few years. We never built the purpose-built asylum processing accommodation that other countries in Europe have right now. So a lot of people are looking at these things going, oh, this is a new thing that's happening. I think that it's something that scares me. I have worries about the people who are coming in, the level of vetting, when actually we have biometrics tests on these people. We do full interviews. We keep people very well surveilled whilst they stay here, and their levels of crime are particularly higher than the regular population. But it's that level to which that it's a new phenomenon that has caused this level of unrest. And they do tend to be pretty happy when people come here and integrate. And I think the man in the grey shirt was correct in saying so. I think it's good. And then in the other area, you have the full-on like re-migration types. They're very similar to the AfD, for example, their position in Germany, where they're one of their campaign stunts, I guess, was to put plane tickets into immigrants' post boxes, saying we're going to deport you if we're going to get into government. That's the kind of ideological position that the re-migration type's making. And he's making was basically an ethno-nationalist argument. These people can't integrate. It's bad they're coming here because they're not part of the ethnic group that we perceive the nation state should be representing, which is a very kind of a early 20th, late 19th century view of what the nation state is supposed to be. So this juxtaposition, this kind of difference between these opinions here, is why you're seeing things such as Nigel Farage, who I think it's clear to me, this is just my speculation, but I think I am willing to at least suggest that I believe this to be true, that the reason why he wanted to get rid of Rupert Lowe, because he was just too extreme. He was representative of the re-migration ethno-nationalist types that you saw from the man in red during that clip. And it doesn't have broad appeal. And you see Nigel Farage in interviews who says, well, migration was good up until the mass migration, and then it became bad. You know, migrants can come here as long as they pay tax and integrate. We can't have too many because of the infrastructure. We need to stop it until we can build the infrastructure to be able to make this thing work again, which is, again, closer to the median position, and then says the small boats have to stop. They have to stop at source. We need to take the boats back, for example. Again, there's no reason to do this because crossing the channel to claim asylum is perfectly fine. But that's where the median position is that Nigel Farage is angling Reform UK towards. And Rupert Lowe was representative of something that actually makes the party look far too extreme and doesn't make them look like a mainstream party. And I think Nigel Farage is probably worried that the more that gets platformed, the more of the red guy's view is going to be more mainstreamed in this country. And that would lead to what we've seen in terms of more of the agitative protests around migrant hotels. We've seen attacks on asylum seekers. We documented one a couple of weeks ago on Novara, a guy from Yemen who'd been attacked in the street. And, it's a really dangerous position that we're in. And this arms race in terms of rhetoric is actually interesting in the way that's affected the Reform Conservative split, because I actually think that Reform are probably to the left of the Conservative Party on a great many issues, especially on what Nigel Farage wants the party to look like on migration, because the Conservatives have to win the arms race in terms of the escalation of rhetoric, because they have to overcome the fact that when they were in government, they created this atmosphere. They deliberately tried to manipulate the public discourse by, in my mind, in my opinion, creating this problem, first of all, by having a crappy Brexit deal that meant that we had the small boat problem created by the lack of sticking to the Dublin Protocol. Then, instead of having it dispersed in communities in the residential accommodation where it wasn't like an individual flashpoint for protest, they put them in hotels at 7 times the cost of putting them in residential accommodation. The contracts went out to Tory donors. So it was a very easy to catch. It was a very eye-catching and very, very polarizing situation that they had created. They created a lightning rod for dissent, and then marketed that as their single pledge, as their single kind of raison d'etre in the run-up to the election, and then failed to deliver on that promise. So they have created the atmosphere for what we're seeing now. Again, in my mind, totally cynically, to try and weaponize the asylum seekers and irregular migration to be a focal point of electoral politics. And then once they failed, they can only kind of one-up where they were before in their extremes. And all the Reform UK have to do is go, well, look at this problem the Tories created and amplified. We'll solve that problem. We don't have a track record of failure. They do. And suddenly we're in the situation where the rhetoric gets more and more extreme. Kieran, this is, again, something that we're seeing more and more on the right wing of politics. It could get pretty nasty pretty quickly. What do you think?
I mean, first of all, stupid observation. The guy in the red hoodie looked a lot like Jimmy Fallon, and I kind of hoped it was him for an elaborate prank. I think that, look, the first time I debated Nigel Farage, it was around the time of the Ballymena riots. And what he was intent on doing, Helena, in that conversation and in his studio, was kind of paying lip service to the, I don't support thuggery or violence, but, and I saw him do that repeatedly on and off air. And I think basically I am perhaps more concerned that Nigel Farage, yes, he expelled Rupert Lowe because Rupert Lowe committed the faux pas of saying the quiet part out loud. But Farage is very skilled at knowing what to say out loud and what to keep quiet. And I think that he is perfectly happy. This is just my opinion, but it's based on observation of him close up. He is perfectly happy to have a coalition that includes guy in the red hoodie and the guy in the grey t-shirt. Now, of course, he would never say that. But it's my considered opinion that is what he is comfortable with. And I think what scares me more is that he is extremely skilled at knowing exactly where, the Overton window, whatever, but he's extremely skilled at knowing where the line is, where the boundary is, what the public will accept. And of course, he has been, more than anyone else, utterly instrumental in shifting that boundary over the past 20 years. I mean, scarily impressive at doing that. It's got a friend who's only sort of intermittently engaged with politics, moved out to Portugal years ago, came back. I told him that Farage was likely to be the next prime minister if things don't change. And he was utterly stunned because he said 20 years ago when we were kids, this was just a fringe figure. And so I think that you don't get to that position without being an extremely skilled ventriloquist for all of the kind of tendencies eddying in the undercurrents, in the political undercurrents. And I think what Farage is brilliant at doing, unfortunately, and, I believe we can beat him. I obviously am willing to put everything into that. But what he is very good at doing is seeing what's eddying undercurrent, seeing what's on the surface and visible, and linking those two things almost subliminally without alienating either part of that coalition. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from there. I just think that the rhetoric that I've heard from him that sounds like him moderating himself is the kind of thing that is actually leading to people to go, I can't support Reform UK. They've gone woke. I mean, we had this ridiculous thing with Nadia Farage having this prison expert, this previous kind of prison expert. She wrote a book about it, coming on and saying something about, we don't want to just put all trans women in men's prisons. And then suddenly everyone's going, Reform's gone woke, we can't vote for them. The Tories are taking a more extreme position on this as well. And like, the Tories are the progenitors of the phrase, quote unquote, stop the boats. And you see that on placards, you see people chanting it in the streets at the protests, and I worry that, again, we're just going to see a continual kind of furthering of the rhetoric and the narrative, especially from what are essentially desperate politicians from the Conservative Party. They can see themselves getting wiped out. Polls are putting them on 20, 15 seats or something like that. Like potentially coming in like 6th or 7th place in an election because of regional parties. So maybe you're right. And Nigel Farage is towing the line so that he can try and hold this coalition together because he believes that the real extremities, the real headbangers and wingnuts have nowhere else to go and they will fall in line eventually. If that's the case and they do end up being able to hide their power level, then that's going to be disastrous for everybody. But whether that's true or not, the Conservative Party's desire to be more extreme to win these people back, given their existing failures on these issues, and the fact they can't run on the economy anymore. A lot of the problems that the Conservative Party had is that they can't run on economic prudence because of Liz Truss. I mean, they should be because of George Osborne, who was far worse, but Liz Truss is this unique figure in Conservative politics that essentially broke apart this kind of mystique, this completely unreasonable kind of public perception of the Conservatives as being good with the economy when they basically never have been, whether it is the recessions under Thatcher and privatisation or the Barber boom or austerity or Liz Truss or whatever it is, or everything that's been done economically by the Tories outside of Harold Macmillan, basically. They can't run on that. They have to stoke the culture war, they have to stoke social tension to be able to drive wedges between people that have unified class interests. And given that there is a party doing that better than they do, there's only a choice of escalation. And that's where I find a real problem lying in the future. Thank you very much, Kieran, for joining me tonight.
It's been a pleasure, despite some obviously very serious stories. It's been great. It's been great to join you. Thanks, Helena.
And thank you everyone else for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.